And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. One man, one microphone, one mission, one message. True News, the only newscast reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And now for the most powerful hour on radio, here is End Time Newsman, Rick Wiles.
This is True News, 1 hour of uncensored news, views, and commentary. Welcome to the program. I'm Rick Wiles. Today is Tuesday, June 24th, 2014. Today is part one of a two-part discussion of the Perestroika Deception. J.R. Nyquist will join me in several minutes to discuss the inside information that a former Soviet K.G.B. officer gave the C.I.A. in the early 1960s about a long-range communist plan to infiltrate, subvert, and morally, financially, and militarily weaken the United States until it is ripe for a full-scale communist takeover. Chris Steinle and I will follow up tomorrow with an in-depth discussion of the spiritual aspects of the Perestroika Deception. I mentioned on yesterday's program the 1985 prophetic warning from the late pastor David Wilkerson that he published in his book, Set the Trumpet to Thy Mouth. There is a connection between my comments yesterday and this two-part discussion of the Perestroika Deception. I hope you will connect the dots. In 1985, David Wilkerson claimed that the Holy Spirit warned him of a Holocaust coming to the USA. Now, when we hear the word Holocaust, we typically think of the Jewish Holocaust during World War II. That's because one definition of the word means the systematic mass slaughter of human life. The actual definition of Holocaust, however, refers to a great or complete devastation or destruction by fire. One night several years ago, as I was climbing into bed, the Holy Spirit admonished me by saying in my spirit, Rick, you are preparing the people to survive an economic collapse. That is the least of their problems. You need to prepare them for the fire. When the Lord spoke to David Wilkerson in 1985 about an American Holocaust, I believe the Lord was referring to a consuming fire. Here are David Wilkerson's exact words from 1985. Quote, before the great Holocaust, there will be smaller holocausts. The oil fields of the Middle East will be ablaze, and the smoke will rise night and day as a warning of the greater Holocaust yet to come. There will be bombs falling on oil fields, on shipping docks, and storage tanks. There will be panic among oil producers, shippers, and upon all nations dependent on that oil. Soon, very soon, an economic nightmare will explode into reality. America is about to face a time of mass hysteria as banks close and financial institutions crumble and our economy spins totally out of control. Gold and silver will lose their value. The chaos that is coming cannot be stopped by our government. The great Holocaust follows an economic collapse in America. The enemy will make its move when we are weak and helpless. Again, these are the words from David Wilkerson in 1985. Some sincere people, including my friend John Shurey, believe that Pastor Wilkerson was referring to the oil fires that were in 1991 when Saddam Hussein's forces set fire to over 700 oil wells as his army withdrew from Kuwait. I see it differently. First, I must ask, why would God give us a warning 23 years or more in advance of a consuming Holocaust fire? Second, no bombs were dropped on oil fields, shipping docks, and storage tanks. Third, there was no panic in the oil industry when Iraqi soldiers set fire to the Kuwaiti oil fields. The Bush administration moved quickly to extinguish those blazes. And fourth, oil prices did not rise. For those reasons, I cannot accept the belief that the 1991 oil fires of Kuwait were the warning sign of an impending fire that will consume the USA. I believe the warning sign is that when we see the oil fields of the entire Middle East ablaze, that is the sign we're supposed to be looking for. That will be our clue that the next part of Mr. Wilkerson's vision is about to be fulfilled. Listen to his words again. This is what he said would happen after bombs fall on oil fields, shipping docks, and storage tanks. He said that there will be panic among all oil producers and shippers and upon all nations dependent on that oil. The panic will spread to create an economic nightmare. Quote, soon, very soon, an economic nightmare will explode into reality. America is about to face a time of mass hysteria as banks close and financial institutions crumble and our economy spins totally out of control. Gold and silver will lose their value. The chaos that is coming cannot be stopped by our government. The great Holocaust follows an economic collapse in America. The enemy will make its move when we are weak and helpless, said David Wilkerson in 1985. Now here's the sequence of events. Bombs fall on the Middle East oil fields, refineries, storage tanks, loading docks. Second, panic will spread among all oil producers, shippers, and oil-dependent nations. Third, the panic will cause an economic nightmare to explode. Fourth, mass hysteria will engulf the USA as banks and financial institutions collapse and the economy spins out of control. Fifth, a great Holocaust follows, an economic collapse, because America's enemy will make its move when the U.S. is weak and helpless. Chris Steinle and I will delve deeper into this prophetic warning tomorrow during part 2 of our discussion about the Perestroika Deception. The attack and invasion could not be successfully carried out until the American Republic is severely weakened, demoralized, corrupted, and infiltrated. That is the connection between the Perestroika Deception and David Wilkerson's 1985 prophecy. I'm going to take a short break. J.R. Nyquist will join me when I return. This is True News, the End Time Newscast.
Reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ, you're listening to True News, the End Time Newscast.
For over 16 years, listener-supported True News has been the champion of news and content not heard in mainline media. The time is at hand. True News has expanded its message to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week on 2 international shortwave stations. That's almost 9,000 hours of programming a year. We now produce or broadcast Revelation Ready, End Times Outpost, True News, Strength for the Journey, Preparing for the End Times, Real Science Radio, Homecoming Radio, and more amazing content is coming. We reach out through radio, YouTube, Blog Talk, Shortwave, and our new smartphone app with over 10,000 downloads in just 2 weeks. True News is spreading the message of the second coming of Jesus Christ because of your faithful support to this vital message.
A message like no other.
But we can only go so far with the resources we have. Keep the message growing and strong. Support True News. Go to TrueNews.com to see how you can keep spreading this critical message. That's TRUNEWS.com.
This is True News, your daily vaccine to protect your mind from mental viruses spread by the establishment news media. I'm Rick Wiles. We would love to hear from you. You may email us at info@truenews.com. There is no E in true, TRUNEWS. Info@truenews.com is our email address, or you can send an old-fashioned letter to the post office. True News, P.O. Box 690069 in Vero Beach, Florida. Our zip code is 32969. And if you want to call us, our office telephone number is area code 772-569-8880. Longtime True News listeners know that I despise communism, socialism, and fascism. In fact, I detest any ism because such political movements always destroy societies. Longtime listeners also know that I firmly believe that the man currently in the White House, publicly identified as Barack Hussein Obama, is a hardcore Marxist communist revolutionary. Furthermore, I believe he is a foreign agent who was chosen, groomed, educated, placed, and assisted along the way for the express purpose of eventually infiltrating the White House to bring about the destruction of the constitutional republic of the United States of America. The West recently observed the 70th anniversary of the D-Day invasion of Normandy. 70 years ago, America was a nation of hardy, devout Christian men and women who believed in God, His Son Jesus Christ, the Holy Bible, and the Ten Commandments. They were fiercely patriotic men and women who reverenced America's founding fathers, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the American flag. The men who fought and died on D-Day were from the greatest generation of American citizens since the glorious days of the American Revolution that was fought for our freedom and liberty. 70 years after D-Day, America in 2014 would be totally unrecognizable to the men who gave their lives in World War II to stop the Nazi Empire. America in 2014 is a nation that has a significant population that embraces socialism or outright Marxist communism, atheism, pornography, sexual perversion, a surveillance police state, excessive taxation, and big government interference or control of every aspect of our daily lives. How did a moral and upright nation fall so far, so fast? Was the fall of the American Republic the result of our own decadence, or the end result of a carefully planned and executed strategy to weaken the American people to such an extent that they would easily be taken over by a foreign force? Today is part one of a two-part discussion on True News on the subject of the Perestroika Deception. Longtime Soviet communist analyst and expert J.R. Nyquist will join me in a few minutes in part one. Tomorrow, Chris Steinle and I will discuss the spiritual aspects of the Perestroika Deception. If the Perestroika Deception is real, what are the present-day risks for those of us alive to see the fulfillment of the grand strategy to deceive the West? The Perestroika Deception is the name of a book published in 1995 by Anatoliy Golitsyn. Mr. Golitsyn was born in Ukraine in 1926. To my knowledge, he is still alive today. He worked in the Strategic Planning Department of the Soviet K.G.B. intelligence agency. He held the rank of major. Operating under the name Ivan Klimov, he was assigned to the Soviet embassy in Helsinki, Finland, as vice consul and attaché. He defected to the C.I.A. in 1961. The agency flew Mr. Golitsyn to Washington, D.C., where he was interrogated by the C.I.A.'s Director of Counterintelligence, James Angleton. In 1962, the chief of the K.G.B. ordered the assassination of Mr. Golitsyn as a traitor to the Soviet Union. Mr. Golitsyn was instrumental in outing a number of high-level Soviet communist moles and double agents inside Western intelligence agencies and governments, including Kim Philby and former British Prime Minister Harold Wilson. Mr. Golitsyn provided the CIA with a detailed report warning of a sinister plot by the communists to deceive Western nations, weaken them morally, financially, and militarily, and eventually absorb them into a global communist New World Order. Frustrated that Western leaders were falling for the Soviet deception, Mr. Golitsyn published 2 books to warn the general public about the communist plan. The first book was New Lies for Old, published in 1984. The second book was Perestroika Deception, published in 1995. Both books are out of circulation. Rare copies are available for approximately $100 each. When we decided to devote 2 days to discussing the Perestroika Deception, I couldn't think of a better guest to start this discussion than J.R. Nyquist. He has devoted his life to understanding and explaining the goals and strategies of the global communist movement. Most likely, many of our True News listeners have in your library J.R.'s classic book, Origins of the Fourth World War. His website is jrnyquist.com. Jeff, welcome back to True News.
Thank you, Rick. It's a great opportunity to talk.
Yes, sir. Well, as I said, and I was very sincere, I couldn't think of a better person to call and invite on the program to discuss Perestroika Deception than you. You've spent your lifetime following, analyzing, digesting, and explaining the overall communist plot in the world. Most Americans, and certainly Western citizens in Europe, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, most of them, Jeff, think the communist movement is over. That was part of the Cold War. We're in a new age, and communism, that was something for our grandparents. It doesn't exist today. What would you say about that line of thinking?
Well, Marxism is a religion, and people do not simply stop believing in their religion because of a news announcement from the Soviet Union. It's just not the way it works. Communism is an international movement that exists around the world, and Moscow was its capital. It's not something that, look, Lenin is still there in the mausoleum in Moscow. People fly in for China. I think, a former K.G.B. officer told me recently that the main reason that the Chinese come to Moscow is to see Lenin's body, the Chinese tourists. And so this worship of this man, Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, is taking place right now under the Russian Federation. And the leader of the Russian Federation is a former K.G.B. officer. And the K.G.B. is the shield and sword of the Communist Party Soviet Union. And what other people don't realize is this Communist Party Soviet Union still exists. Is recently on Ukrainian television, a Ukrainian local leader from Eastern Ukraine appearing on the Schuster program, Schuster Live in Kiev, stated, he said, the causes of the separatist movement in Eastern Ukraine is the Communist Party Soviet Union. He was telling them, we all know it still exists. We all know it's running everything. And nobody on that show contradicted him.
Jeff, what do you know about the defector, Anatoliy Golitsyn?
Well, you just read his biography. He's a fairly secretive person. He's been in witness protection here in the United States since his defection. But largely the Western elite has, for political reasons, there's a denial of deception, and so they do not want to hear Golitsyn, mainly because the standard view of history is that the Soviet Union collapsed, that there were revolutions that swept Eastern Europe that replaced the communist regimes there with liberal democratic regimes, which is only partly true. The fact is that the Soviet Union ordered the Velvet Revolution. We know this because of former STB officials, especially Mr. Zivchak, who was given the order from Moscow to form the student groups, communist-controlled anti-communist organizations that created the revolution in Czechoslovakia. We know from Andrei Kadrescu's book, The Hole in the Flag, he was there. He testifies to finding evidence that the overthrow of Ceausescu was ordered from Moscow. Then we have the books, the Polish researchers who've pointed out that Lech Walesa in Poland was an agent of the communist secret police, codenamed Bolek. We have also, in East Germany, things went wrong for the Russians. That's what went wrong with their strategy toward the beginning of it. But look at who's in power in Germany. We have Angela Merkel, and there's been a recent book come out in Germany. It's not out in English yet, showing that this woman has hidden things about her past, that she was a leader within the Communist Youth Organization in East Germany, and the pioneers.
There are photographs of her recently published in uniform in the East German Communist Party.
And she received training in the Soviet Union.
Jeff, do you think that part of the reason here in the United States that Mr. Golitsyn has been marginalized and pushed aside and his warnings ignored is because the communists have so successfully infiltrated American intelligence agencies and political entities?
Yes, but even more so because they have infiltrated the political right. It is impossible that they could have, how is it that conservative opinion leaders, writers for such magazines as National Review and the American Spectator back in the 80s and early 90s, how is it that these people were against Golitsyn? The people, conservatives, anti-communists. I thought at the time that James Burnham was dead by then, but James Burnham, of all of them, would have said something. But it was William Buckley, when the August coup happened in Moscow in 1991, wrote an attack on Golitsyn in National Review, which was shocking in the lies. And there was just lies that he wrote about Golitsyn.
But Buckley was a CIA operative. His brother was a CIA agent.
He had been in the CIA in Mexico after he graduated college. He worked for the CIA. That's right.
Jeff, let's for listeners who, a lot of our listeners don't even know what we're talking about in terms of the Perestroika Deception. Take a few minutes and summarize Golitsyn's his warning in the book Perestroika Deception. What was the gist of what he was telling us?
Well, he wrote two books. The first one is called New Lies for Old, which was published in 1984, but he wrote it, most of it, in the late 70s or during the 1970s, and had been written most of that by 1982. And they were based on memoranda that he had written to the CIA, which were published in raw form, in many of them in the Perestroika Deception, which was then published in, I think, 95. But what's fascinating is that this book, published in 1984, predicted everything that happened after Gorbachev came to power, which was in the following year, in 85. Golitsyn predicted in a chapter titled The Final Phase, Golitsyn predicts that the long-range strategy of the communists in the Soviet Union would involve a false liberalization of the Soviet Union, that the Communist Party would give up power, that the Berlin Wall might go down, that the countries in Eastern Europe would have apparent independence, that the Warsaw Pact would dissolve. That was the Warsaw Pact was the communist treaty organization that brought all the communist countries into one military bloc. He also said that one major element of the deception was the supposed antagonism between the Soviet Union and Red China, that antagonism was a deception, that it was organized in the late 1950s, and that it was discussed by Alexander Sholotin, the head of the K.G.B. in 1959 in a lecture that Golitsyn had attended, in which he said, when Tito split from Stalin, Tito was the communist dictator of Yugoslavia, when they had a split back in the late 1940s, that the West, particularly the United States, rushed in to help Yugoslavia. Well, they conceived of creating a false split between Moscow and some other communist country so that the West would help that other communist country. And at the end of the lecture, someone raised their hand and said, "Comrade General, what country do we propose for this false split with the Soviet Union?" And Sheletin told the KGB officer that it was China was the candidate. And of course, we know the Sino-Soviet rift began to develop in the following year, 1960.
Jeff, for our younger listeners who either weren't alive or children at the time of the so-called fall of the Soviet Union, what we here in the West, what we were hearing and seeing in the news was that the Soviet Union, the communist apparatus had collapsed, the Soviet economy collapsed, the political machinery, the Communist Party collapsed, and that Mikhail Gorbachev was the new face of Russia, and this age of perestroika, openness, reform had come to Russia, and that the Russian people were rejecting communism. They were liberalizing their institutions. They were introducing capitalism, democratic voting, and so forth. They wanted to become friends with the West. And the Cold War was over. It was buried, and this was a new day. Now, as you pointed out, Mr. Golitsyn warned. What he wrote in the 70s and the 80s, he warned that this is precisely what was going to be presented, and that it was what he called the Perestroika Deception, that this was all contrived. It was all part of a grand master strategy to deceive and fool the Western nations into believing that Soviet communism was dead and the Cold War was over. But in fact, what they did is that they infiltrated, they penetrated every Western institution, education, politics, State Department, the intelligence agencies, the news media, the political parties. They even got, as you said, they even succeeded in changing the mindset of conservative American political thinkers who were at one time vehemently anti-communist. So it was an amazing strategy that he saw coming, and he had knowledge. He had knowledge as a KGB strategist that this was what was going to be perpetrated on the West. Mm-hmm. What were some of the things he said would be used, some of the strategies that would be used to weaken the American people?
Well, Golitsyn's focus was mostly on the basic methods used by the Soviet Union for, the sort of basic things like the scissors strategy. The scissors strategy is a strategy, in a scissors you have two blades, and each blade cuts against the other, right? So that the blades appear to be opposing each other, but what they're used for is cutting a third object, as in rock, paper, scissors. The scissors cuts the paper. This is best illustrated by the creation of, or the infiltration of, foreign or domestic groups that then are set against each other, like what we see in Ukraine today. It's very important to understand that what happened in Yugoslavia, the breakup of Yugoslavia, and the civil war there that occurred after that breakup in the early 1990s, and the current separatist trouble in Ukraine, are dress rehearsals for what they plan for the United States. The infiltration of various political groups in the United States can serve the purpose in the future of creating a civil war here, in which Soviet agents control both sides in the civil war.
Oh, wait a minute. That's a pretty deep comment. That communist agents would control both sides of a future civil war in the United States.
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, for example, let's say you have, let's say there's a terrorist attack on the United States, okay? And let's say this is a scenario, for the sake of argument, that this current border trouble in Texas is meant as a diversion so that weapons of mass destruction can be moved through Arizona, which has been stripped, and that of border protection, and that of course some figures in the government are secret communist agents helping this to happen. Then let's say a nuclear device in the weekend of July 4th through 6th goes off at Houston, Texas, and cripples aspects of our oil infrastructure there. The President of the United States would declare very possibly martial law. The dollar could collapse. You could have the President establishing the first elements of a dictatorship because that's part of a agreed-upon strategy. Then you have patriotic elements saying, no, this is some kind of a takeover scheme. And then they organize to oppose the government, and then you can have a civil war begin where people say what the government's doing illegal, and the government says you need to obey the government because of the terrorist attack. And then they are fighting each other. And in the midst of all that, the U.S. defensive structures collapse as the economy collapses away.
Jeff, do you suspect, and I'm not asking you to name names, I'm just asking you to confirm yes or no, do you suspect that some high-profile leaders in the so-called patriot movement, or, you could say the Tea Party movement, possibly could be communist moles who are there for the purpose of instilling anger and fury in patriotic Americans against Washington and the federal government for the purpose of igniting a violent outburst against Washington at a certain date in the future?
I do believe so. I mean, as far as the infiltration, the communists infiltrate every organization they consider important. And provocation is the main method. I just mentioned the scissors strategy, but the scissors strategy is an exploitation for the main Soviet method, which is provocation. And of course, what I just described in my scenario is a provocation. The nuclear weapons a provocation. What the government does is a provocation. And then even what the rebels against the government do is a provocation. And each one feeds upon the other. And, of course, we know from the work of Stanton Evans, and we know from the recent book by Diana West, American Betrayal, we know the story, the history of the infiltration of the United States from the very moment that we established relations with the Soviet Union. And they began using the Communist Party USA personnel to recruit and penetrate the U.S. government. The penetration was gigantic, so huge that the people around the President of the United States in the White House were Soviet agents, many of them. 1943, Venona determined that they were using our Venona decrypts. We had broken the Soviet code. There were over 320 Soviet agents working out of the White House, working for the executive branch. I should not out of the White House, working for the executive branch of the government. We know that they infiltrated the Agriculture Department, was one of the primary ones they infiltrated first. And then, of course, they infiltrated the Treasury Department and the State Department. Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White was in Treasury. There were 2 spy rings operating in Washington. And the investigations against that didn't end with Joseph McCarthy. We were able to do many investigations of communist activity in the United States. Unfortunately, by 1980, all of those investigations stopped. There were no more investigations of internal subversion in the United States. They weren't permitted.
And now it's just the other way around, Jeff. The Department of Homeland Security and the Justice Department consider patriotic Americans to be the subversives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they're being prepared to fight a civil war, just like the American people elements are being prepared. I mean, you know who Alex Jones is, right?
Yes, sir, I do.
Well, Alex Jones has been an associate of former and present LaRoucheite people. Well, Lyndon LaRouche was a guy who was a communist who taught Marxism-Leninism in the 1960s, who was involved in experiments, communist experiments in creating Marxist. He created in 1971 a Marxist right-wing political party in the United States called the U.S. Labor Party. And of course, this was sort of an important experiment for the Soviets, for the K.G.B, because it's a model for what's going on in Europe right now. The communists want to control the right, and Putin's shifting to the right and pretending to defend Christianity is an alibi to help propel this forward.
Many of Alex Jones's guests are revolutionaries and anarchists. I mean,
yes, that's right.
We could go down the list of, I could name names. Many of them are revolutionaries and anarchists, including, he's had members of the Communist Party on his program. Some members of the U.S. Congress who are clearly communists. Various Hollywood celebrities and others who are truly anarchists. And I always, I have a serious question about why he associates with those kind of people.
Well, his funding comes through LaRouche. Some of his funding comes through LaRouche, as I understand it. Somebody may correct me if I'm making a mistake here, but Webster Tarpley, a former longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche, often appears on his show, and he's appeared on Russian television supporting Putin when Putin invaded Georgia. So there's a lot of people who are on as alternative guests on alternative media programs who also appear on RT, Russia Today. Now, I never get an invitation to RT, and I wouldn't. No,
I
you talk about Golitsyn, and they do not. Well, that is a word that the Russians do not want uttered on the media in the United States or on any media.
Where does Lyndon LaRouche get his money?
Well, like I said, what I have heard is that he gets it through the LaRoucheites. And Lyndon LaRouche is a man who we know formed a relationship with the K.G.B. in the 1970s, at least by that time, probably before. And he is a man who has made many trips to Moscow. I have friends from that part of the world who tell me that he even spoke before meetings of the Central Committee in the Soviet Union in the past. He's a very knowledgeable theorist about Marxism-Leninism. And, the scissors, partly in developing the scissors strategy, the Soviet Union wanted to develop right-wing parties throughout the world, not just in the United States, but here it was very important too, that would basically follow a communist line while also espousing right-wing or supposedly, apparently conservative views. This is you see how these right-wing parties in Europe are starting to prevail. Well, what a lot of people don't realize is that those right-wing parties in Europe, many of them look to Moscow for support.
Jeff, are you were you acquainted with the Romanian pastor Dumitru Duduman?
Oh yeah, I've read his book Through the Fire Without Burning. Yes.
Yeah, okay, but there's what I'm thinking of. There's a particular prophecy prediction that he made. This is back in the 1990s. He said that prior to a Russian attack on the United States, the U.S. government would be preoccupied putting down an insurrection in the heartland of America that was instigated by the communists. All right, this sounds very close to what we're talking about right now. Communist activity in the United States right now to provoke a civil war in this country.
Yes, well, of course, I'll tell you a story. A fellow wrote to me many years ago when I was writing for WorldNet Daily, and he was a soldier who was in some kind of UN task force in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and he befriended a GRU officer, or rather a Spetsnaz officer, a Russian paratrooper. And he finally said to the Russian paratrooper, he said, "What are you guys doing here in Yugoslavia?" And the Russian said, we're training for what is going to happen in your country. And, of course, the guy was an American, so he was talking about Yugoslavia being like in America. In Yugoslavia, you have a president. You had a president who was connected to Moscow, who's a communist, and then you had him do provocative things that caused the country to break apart. And you had Communist Party members who suddenly became local nationalists. Slovenian or Croatian or Bosnian nationalists, and a lot of people don't know that of course, if you look at Ukraine, the same thing. You have a president in Kiev, Mr. Yanukovych, who was connected to Moscow, and then you had a revolution against him, and now you have this sort of they're trying to start a civil war in Ukraine. It's not quite coming off because their strategies don't always work. But that's what they're trying to do here.
Jeff, we have this bizarre situation in America and Russia today where the U.S., the American public, has been dumbed down morally through the media and the entertainment industry. They are embracing homosexuality, occultism, New Ageism, atheism. And simultaneously in Russia, what we're hearing and seeing in the media is that the Russians are rejecting and rebelling against Western decadence, that they don't want American immorality to come to Russia. And so they're taking a stand against homosexuality. They're taking a stand against pornography and vulgarity in public and such. How do you explain this?
Well, the guy that began the homosexual movement was a Communist Party member here in the U.S. And the same can be said for feminism. The actual destruction of our morality was an objective of the communists, because if we were upright and moral, our society would not be penetrable by their agents. They were having trouble in the 1950s recruiting Americans, going into a broad area. And because they needed to not just penetrate the government, they realized they needed to penetrate banks, churches, financial and corporate organizations, private organizations of all kinds to carry out their strategy, their long-term strategy. And, of course, we know how successfully they penetrated the government. Well, they needed Americans to be unscrupulous, because to widen this, there's not that many ideological communists. Most of the people they used as agents in World War II to penetrate the U.S. government were communist true believers. In order to have to turn thousands more people into agents, into reliable agents, they needed to be able to bribe them or use blackmail against them.
So, Jeff, was the strategy to take down the United States, the communist strategy was we have to first destroy Christianity in America. We have to to defile the hearts and minds of the American people. We have to bring them into just total depravity, so they reject their Christian values, and then at the time that America has become just morally bankrupt, on the Russian side, they begin embracing Christianity and morality, which now sends a message to Christians in America. Look what's happening. Russia is now the leader of morality in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, is this a deliberate strategy?
Yes, and it's called an alibi. See, when you're going to destroy somebody, you want to erase the evidence. You want an alibi. Oh, we didn't do it. We're returning to Christianity. We had nothing to do with your moral unraveling. That's all. That's the result of decadent capitalism.
But the truth is, going back to the 20s and 30s, the communists were infiltrating American institutions to bring about a collapse of Christianity in this country.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. They infiltrated the things they went for first before they started infiltrating on a wider basis is they picked celebrities because of their limited resources. They picked famous artists and musicians, writers, and they would even try to get their agents to be the mistresses or the wives of these people. There's a book called Double Lives that came out in the 90s outlining this. Willy Munzenberg, I think, is the one that's thought up a lot of the strategy. He's a German communist. I mean, they thought up, absolutely devilish things. I mean, the strategies that they use are brilliant. And they've proven to be in the long term effective because we had no defense against it. We didn't try to defend ourselves. We weren't even aware of it.
Some of the Hollywood stars who we now know were members of the Communist Party. I mean, Lucille Ball. I Love Lucy. Lucy was a member of the Communist Party. Will Geer, who played Grandpa on The Waltons, was a member of the Communist Party. And so that's just a tip of the iceberg. I mean, the infiltration certainly went far deeper than getting Hollywood stars and celebrities to carry out communist objectives. The real danger was the infiltration of intelligence agencies, the military, the political parties. Do you think that the present-day Democratic Party in America is essentially the Communist Party of the United States?
Well, I would say that it's the Social Democratic Party. It's become a Marxist party. The Republican Party, you could call it the the joke is the Republican Party is the alternative left.
I see it as I see as the Democrats are the Marxist wing of the Communist Party and the Republicans are the socialist wing of the Communist Party. Because because big business now has been so penetrated and infiltrated. They targeted the capitalist. Once you target capitalism, remember they are communists. They believe their real enemy wasn't the U.S. government; that the U.S. government was always the puppet of the large banks and corporations. So they got smart. They started targeting there. So why is it that all this money is flowing to all these causes from private organizations, from private foundations and corporations and so on, and major financial players? Why is the left supported in this way? Well, GE has got, for years had collaborated with the overseas communists, sending technology to countries like the Soviet Union. I mean, GE has a famous history of that. So, Jeff, we got about 4 minutes remaining. How far along are we in 2014 in the implementation of the Perestroika Deception?
Well, one of the reason that we're still able to talk about this and that we're not defeated already is the Soviet Union experienced major problems in the carrying out of its deception in Europe. Although they've partly recovered, they suffered a real setback when German nationalist or patriotic forces in Germany basically counter-subverted their organization in East Germany. What the Soviets were trying to do in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, when that occurred, was they were trying to unify Germany through a process that would take 5-6 years. That then the unified Germany would be under socialist control and would drop out of NATO and form an alliance with the Soviet Union. And they would break NATO by this means while they were liberalizing the Soviet Union and dissolving the Warsaw Pact.
Breaking NATO has been a major objective throughout this process, hasn't it?
And the fact that NATO still exists is a huge problem for them. And, of course, one of the accidents that occurred at that point was that the Soviet army was on the soil suddenly of a NATO country, and it demoralized their army. And they had major defections of technical people. And the army fell apart. It was no longer able to perform its mission. And then they had to bring the army home over a period of years. And, of course, this demoralization spread, and you had Ukrainian patriots who had infiltrated the Soviet army preparing a civil war in the Soviet Union. and they lost control of parts of the Soviet army. So they had to break up the Soviet Union and get the Ukrainians out of the Russian, separate them out from the Russian armed forces. And they had to disarm the Ukrainians by removing all the nuclear weapons from Ukraine. So this was a process, the breakup of the Soviet Union, although they had contingency plans for it, they had to do it. And it caused a major demoralization of a lot of their cadre and organizations, which they had to subsequently rebuild. So you have to go back and you have to say, okay, so what extent have they rebuilt to see where they are today? And, of course, two important things. Who's in the White House right now? And the fact that they're trying to get Ukraine back into the Union and trying to put the Soviet Union back together again, which is proving difficult for them.
Jeff, I got to tell you this. This is a true story. The reason this two-part series came together on Perestroika Deception was that a member of our staff, Chris Steinle, well, let me back this up. The previous day, I had received a call where a source told me, now this is actually about a month ago, a source told me, Rick, there's going to be a war in Europe over Ukraine, and Barack Obama is going to do nothing. The Russians are going to attack. Obama is going to fiddle and wring his hands and do nothing, and the eventual result will be the weakening of NATO to the point that it is viewed as a paper tiger, and it basically begins to break up. The very next day, Chris Steinle, who was on our staff, came to me and he said, Rick, man, I've been reading this old book called Perestroika Deception. And he said, the plan is to weaken NATO and bring it down. Yeah. And so I had this 1-2 punch coming at me, in 2 days. I said, wait a minute, I just heard this yesterday from a source. So do you think there's a possibility that perhaps this year we may see some kind of action in Ukraine and Obama does nothing, and then the world starts to say, the U.S., NATO is just a paper tiger, and it doesn't exist anymore?
The Polish foreign minister was,
yes.
The Polish foreign minister was recorded secretly saying this exact thing.
So he said the alliance with the United States is worthless.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And, of course, we see in Iraq that Obama won't do anything, and Iraq is going to fall. So what confidence does the Polish foreign minister have, or the Romanian government, or the Baltic states government, or Finland, or Sweden? Sweden hasn't even entered NATO yet. But.
Try to squeeze in one or two more questions because I'm already running over my time. Do you think, is Barack Obama a foreign agent? Is he a communist agent?
I don't have positive information saying that he is.
But your gut feeling, what do you think?
Well, we know from the research of Trevor Loudon that he has a communist background, a thorough communist background. And there was a former K.G.B. officer from Ukraine who has publicly stated that he met Obama on a street in Moscow back in, I think, 1982. I forget what year he said it was. But and I forget the guy's name, but he's living in the United States somewhere. He had to flee. He got into a little caper over there, and he had to flee. But and I don't know if what he's saying is true. That's the only testimony I know of that. And of course, there is a fellow that I interviewed years ago who had been in Moscow, an American. His name eludes me now. Who also said that Obama was mentioned to him in Moscow as you're going to have a communist president, and his name is going to be Barack, but she didn't remember his last name.
Oh, I actually interviewed that man. He's from California. He operated a computer IT company, was in Moscow after the fall of the Soviet Union, was taken to dinner by a group of his clients in Russia who were all high-level, quote, former communists. And the woman seated next to him turned to him and said, you're going to have a communist president someday. And she went into a detailed description of this future communist president. This was the early 90s.
I spent a lot of time talking with this man, checking out his background, yes.
You think it's a true story?
I believe the man is sincere.
Mm-hmm.
I do. I was, when I first heard the story, I thought that's impossible. But then talking to him, the guy is credible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one last question. Based on what you know about Golitsyn's warnings, what do you suspect may be the next thing we see happen that would be a continuation of this strategy?
Well, Russia's mobilizing right now. They go through a series, and China's doing this, different excuses to mobilize troops. And I think that, what I would look for is a provocation. What we're expecting to happen, to move the ball forward, always is some kind of provocation. And then a wrong move on the part of the United States government or in Europe somewhere that's going to start to shift the whole balance of power so that it's no longer a world that America is the strong country, but it's Russia and China.
All right, this is the conclusion of part one of our two-part discussion, the Perestroika Deception. Chris Steinle will be here tomorrow. We will pick up on this discussion and take it even deeper. We'll talk about the spiritual aspects of this deception and what it means to us as Americans and, in fact, to all Westerners. My guest today, J.R. Nyquist. He's the author of the classic book, Origins of the Fourth World War. His website is jrnyquist.com. And I encourage you to go online and find essays written about the Perestroika Deception. And if you can find a copy of the book and you're willing to shell out $100 or more for the book, it is worth reading. Jeff, thank you so much. I appreciate you spending this time with us today.
Okay, Rick, thanks. It's an important subject.
Hey, was it my imagination or was there a lot of clicks on the phone line during that interview? I heard a lot of clicking throughout the conversation with JR. Oh, well, perhaps others are interested in the Perestroika Deception, or at least interested in what we have to say about it. I've been pondering in my spirit the two things the Holy Spirit has brought to my attention in recent days. First, he reminded me about the Perestroika Deception, a topic I haven't thought about for years. Second, the 1985 prophetic warning by David Wilkerson that America's enemy will strike when the USA is in a weakened state. And that weakened state will be when fires engulf the Middle East oil fields and panic sets off an economic collapse that nobody can contain. When the Lord showed me in 1998 a vision of American cities on fire, he told me that there would be a financial nightmare caused by the collapse of derivatives. I had never heard of derivatives in 1998, but I knew the Lord told me to watch for signs of the derivatives collapsing. The Holy Spirit showed me in 1998 that the economic panic would be followed by a surprise attack and land invasion of the USA. And that is very similar to David Wilkerson's prophetic warning, the Perestroika Deception. Chris Steinle and I will continue the conversation today. I think a lot of things happening in America over decades, and especially since Barry Soetoro came to power, will start to make sense as you understand the Perestroika Deception. One of my biggest frustrations doing this radio program is my inability to tie together all of the daily news stories in a way that you can process it and digest it and see the big picture of what is happening. I personally don't think I do a good enough job with that responsibility. I think about it all the time. There's so much happening day after day, and our staff is so small that I find myself up to my eyeballs every day trying to just keep up with what's happening in the world. And when I finish the program each day, I always wonder if I successfully deliver to you a coherent message about what I see happening and who I believe is behind it. I think today's program will help you see things more clearly. The American people are being told every day by the establishment to accept things that they don't believe or desire. It doesn't matter. The political establishment, the news media establishment, the educational establishment, the entertainment industry establishment, and so forth, control the vast organs of communication in this nation. They have the biggest microphone and the loudest speakers. Therefore, we are forced to listen to them, even though we don't agree with them and don't want to agree with them. They are a minority, but they control most of the nation's institutions of influence. Over decades of unrelenting propaganda, they are succeeding in reshaping the thinking of a significant portion of the American people to reflect their un-American and un-Christian views and values. You and I represent the last bastion of resistors that they must overcome or eliminate. Let me give you some examples from today's news headlines. Vice President Joe Biden told a gathering of homosexual rights activists that gay rights is a defining mark of a civilized nation and that homosexuality must trump cultural and social traditions. Of course, when Mr. Biden says homosexual rights trumps cultural and social traditions in importance, he is referring to religious values that oppose sexual perversion. He said, and he was speaking to guests at the Naval Observatory's vice presidential mansion, he said, quote, "I don't care what your culture is. Inhumanity is inhumanity is inhumanity," end of quote. The U.S. Vice President said that Barack Obama has directed the U.S. State Department to ensure that American diplomacy and foreign assistance promotes the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered men and women around the world. He also said that all U.S. government agencies have been instructed by the president to make the promotion of homosexual rights a top priority. Mr. Biden expressed his concern that nearly 80 countries have adopted or are planning to adopt laws that prohibit or regulate homosexual conduct in public. For example, the Obama administration recently canceled a U.S. military exercise in Uganda because that nation refuses to repeal its law that outlaws homosexual acts. Now, this is not the first time that Joe Biden has talked about culture, national values, and homosexual rights. 1 year ago, May 2013, he told Jews attending a Democratic Party reception for Jewish American Heritage Month that Jews in the U.S. media are responsible for changing the views of the American people to accept homosexuality and same-sex marriage. Referring to the diminishing public opposition to same-sex marriage, Mr. Biden credited the Jewish leaders for using their media and entertainment industry clout to mold and shape public opinion. He said, quote, "I bet you 85% of those changes, whether it's in Hollywood or social media, are a consequence of Jewish leaders in the industry. The influence is immense. And I might add, it is all to the good," end of quote. The vice president is not the only top U.S. official telling governments around the world that the United States of America now demands all nations to accept homosexuality. Susan Rice, the national security advisor to Barack Obama, told 200 homosexual rights activists that the Obama administration is promoting homosexual rights in America as an example to the rest of the world. She said that President Obama has ordered a diplomatic and financial effort to promote the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered men and women around the world. And she said, this is a work to which we are called. America's support for LGBT rights is not just a national cause, but it is a global enterprise, said Mrs. Rice. Ms. Rice said that the U.S. has a duty to lead the world in stopping discrimination against homosexuals. And again, she pointed out that 80 nations have laws that encourage, that restrict homosexual activity in the country. She cited Nigeria, Uganda, Russia, and other countries for their laws. Now, Ms. Rice met with homosexual rights leaders from 10 nations at the Eisenhower Executive Office building next to the White House. News reporters were permitted to observe her speech, but the reporters were banned from covering the rest of the meeting with the assembled homosexual activists from around the world. The American Jewish World Service Executive Vice President Robert Bank said his group wants Barack Obama to appoint in the U.S. State Department a special diplomat to promote global homosexual rights. Okay, that's example number one of something that's in the news today that defies logic. The American people have never accepted, nor condoned, nor wanted homosexual rights, but the establishment has demanded it. Let's take a look at another issue that defies logic: illegal immigration. U.S. borders have been non-functioning for years. Regardless of whether the president in the White House was George Bush or Barack Obama, the result was the same. The U.S. government ignored the pleas of the American people to close the borders, to stop the invasion from South America, and to round up the criminal trespassers in this country and ship them home. In previous years, both Mr. Bush and Mr. Obama pretended to be concerned. They pretended that they wanted to do something about it. Mr. Obama, however, has taken off his mask this year and is supervising a full-scale foreign invasion of the United States. He has ordered the Border Patrol agents to release tens of thousands of captured illegal immigrants. The U.S. government is transporting thousands of illegals to numerous American cities and dropping them off on the streets. We're being told to believe that 100,000 little children from Central America simply got up one day and walked 1,000 miles or more by themselves and entered the USA. The media tells us that U.S. Border Patrol agents are too busy changing diapers to have time to deal with the invasion. Let me ask you a common sense question. How do diaper-wearing toddlers walk across Central America into the USA? These children are being airlifted into America with the full support and supervision of America's Saul Alinsky-trained community organizer in the White House, Barry Soetoro. Now, let's look at example number 3. A congressional report warns that ISIS, the al-Qaeda army now invading Iraq, wants to establish an Islamic State in the Middle East to be the launching pad for attacks on the U.S. homeland. Now, I want you to see the insanity in this report. First, ISIS is the name of an Egyptian goddess, so that's a clear indication we are dealing with Freemasonry and the Illuminati. Second, the leader of ISIS is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. At one time, he was captured and detained by U.S. forces in Iraq. But how did he get loose? Barry Soetoro, Barack Obama, released him when he entered the White House in 2009, just like he released 5 Taliban murderers weeks ago. Third, the ISIS Islamic Army was covertly trained by U.S. military advisors in Jordan. As I have repeatedly warned, the U.S. is arming al-Qaeda in the war against Syria. Earlier this week, ISIS released a chilling promotional video inviting young Muslims around the world to join its global jihadist army to establish an Islamic caliphate. Keep in mind that ISIS is made up of Muslim monsters who decapitate and crucify Christians who do not denounce Jesus Christ. We're now told that ISIS has a professionally produced promotional video recruiting soldiers to attack the West. ISIS also has apps and a social media presence. London's Guardian newspaper asked the question days ago, who is behind ISIS's terrifying online propaganda operation? Well, I can answer that question for The Guardian. The people behind the propaganda operation are the same people who trained and armed ISIS. And that brings us back to the criminal cabal that has captured control of the United States of America. You and I are being forewarned by the U.S. news media and politicians, now remember, who Joe Biden thanked for promoting homosexual rights, that ISIS is coming for us. But who is arming and training ISIS? The U.S. government, with the full and active support of Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and John Boehner. That's who. Days ago, the media told us that ISIS captured Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons factory and stockpile. What? You mean years of war and hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers couldn't find the factory and stockpile, but several thousand Muslim jihadists marched into Iraq last week and found it on their first day in town? Are you serious? Who are these people trying to fool? But the message is clear. America, get ready for chemical attacks in your cities. British Prime Minister David Cameron, another puppet of the cabal, warned his country that ISIS plans to, quote, attack us here at home in the United Kingdom. Listen, don't blame Mr. Cameron. He merely reads whatever his handlers write for him to say. Senator Lindsey Graham told CBS News that ISIS is grouping in Iraq and Syria to attack American cities. Really, Lindsey? Mr. Graham, you are one of the cabal's little minions in Washington who has pushed so hard to arm al-Qaeda and ISIS. Do you really think we don't see through your lies and deception? As Washington politicians and the national news media prepare us for future attacks by ISIS, the same people are deliberately orchestrating and supervising a massive invasion of illegal immigrants across America's borders. There is no border security at this point in 2014. This is a full-scale invasion. How many terrorists do you think have already entered the country? How many weapons do you think have already been brought into this country? Do you see where this is going? There is a massive deception underway. It is the Perestroika Deception. Our nation has been infiltrated, compromised, and weakened from within. I'll take a short break. When I return, Chris Steinle and I will discuss the Perestroika Deception. This is True News, the last newscast that has not been compromised, infiltrated, or bought off. Stand with us and support True News today.
Reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ, you're listening to True News, the end-time newscast.
For over 16 years, listener-supported True News has been the champion of news and content not heard in the mainline media. True News has expanded its message to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week on 2 international shortwave stations.
That's almost 9,000 hours of programming a year.
We now produce or broadcast
Revelation Ready,
End Times Outpost,
True News,
Strength for the Journey,
Preparing for the End Time,
Real Science Radio.
Homecoming Radio,
More amazing content is coming. We reach out through radio,
YouTube,
blog talk,
Shortwave,
and our new smartphone app with over 10,000 downloads in just 2 weeks. True News is spreading the message of the second coming of Jesus Christ because of your faithful support to this vital message. A message like no other. But we can only go so far with the resources we have. Keep the message growing and strong.
support True News.
Go to TrueNews.com to see how you can keep spreading this critical message. That's TRUNEWS.com.
Well, this is True News. I'm Rick Wiles. We are your end-time no-dos to keep you from falling asleep in the last days under the spell of deception. And we need your financial support this week to keep going strong. Please donate your best gift by the end of the week to help us cover our expenses for June. We don't expect to receive a check from George Soros. He is financing the left-wing news media. He's not going to finance True News. That's up to you. So we need to hear from you very soon. Give online at truenews.com, TRUNEWS, truenews.com, or at PayPal using support at truenews.com. If you want to send a check, a money order, precious metals, or foreign currency, you should mail it to Post Office Box 690069, P.O. Box 690069, Vero Beach, Florida, 32969. That's our zip code. Hey, if you're looking for a job, the United Nations is looking for people with experience in confiscating guns. The job posting appears on the UN Career Opportunities page. The position is for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration officer. If hired, you'll work with the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and some of the job perks include being allowed to rape women in third world nations and spread infectious diseases like the UN spread in Haiti. Duck Dynasty star Phil Robertson told people attending a Rock the South music festival that it's time to vote those ungodly politicians out of Congress. Phil, I love you, brother, but I wish it would happen, but I need to tell you, it's too late. The coup d'etat has already happened. The overthrow is complete. Elections in America are worthless at this point. Another good man, Retired neurosurgeon Dr. Ben Carson told Newsmax that America's Christian values have been ripped out of the nation by a long line of progressively minded policies that have changed America's culture. He recommended that people read the 1958 book, The Naked Communists. I read the book. I have it in my library. Dr. Carson, America wasn't changed by progressive policies. We're changed by communist policies. By the way, why is Dr. Carson retired as one of America's most skilled and gifted brain surgeons? For one reason, he publicly criticized Barack Obama. That's where we're at in this country today. You criticize Obama, you lose your job. House Speaker John Boehner said today he will file a lawsuit against President Obama over abuse of power. He said, quote, "This is not about impeachment. It's about him faithfully executing the laws of this country," end of quote. Well, Mr. Boehner, it is about impeachment, and that's why you're filing the lawsuit. Let me assure you, folks, of one thing. Nothing will come of this lawsuit. Mr. Boehner's job is to run defense for Obama's takeover of America. Mr. Boehner is compromised. He is part of the criminal outfit that has taken over the country. This lawsuit is to distract your attention from calls for Obama's impeachment. Mr. Boehner is filing his phony lawsuit in order to persuade rambunctious House Republicans from filing articles of impeachment. He's running out the clock. Everything John Boehner has done as Speaker is to protect Barack Obama from a serious investigation. What does entertainer Pat Boone know about Barack Obama's birth? He made a cryptic remark on the Alan Combs radio show. Listen to Pat Boone.
Yeah, I do. We won't have time to talk about some of these other smoking guns like the IRS selectively losing just the email records that Congress has demanded, and the same loss of 6 others that they also want to question on the same times, all of them on their hard drives. They just mysteriously lost all those things. That's what Nixon claimed about the erasure of tapes when at the White House. I mean, it's identically the same thing, only this on a much broader scale than the IRS doing it, the ones that take our taxes. So we won't have time to dwell on that. But what I'm going to predict here is that by September of this year, the major smoking gun, which is a high crime, not just a misdemeanor, but a high crime, that supposed copy of the birth certificate that is displayed on the White House website as we talk by many experts has already been proven to be not a copy of anything, of something perhaps that doesn't exist, which is an actual birth certificate, but it is a photoshopped fraud created to look like what they wanted it to look like. And I say they because I don't think it was the president himself, but those around him. But experts who understand the techniques of these things, including a guy in my own office who knows how things are photoshopped and knows the telltale signs of things that have been pasted onto other documents or other things. It is obviously, to anybody that knows that process, a fraud. It is not a copy of anything, and that is a high crime.
Are you saying this will be revealed?
Yeah.
When?
The evidence, I say by September.
And tell me how you know this.
Well, I'm talking to some people that, they are trained. I'll say this, they're trained detectives and investigators, and I've been trying to get people in Congress to pay attention to these things and create that we shouldn't have to be us citizens saying, wait a minute, this thing doesn't look real. These things this man and the administration are doing are not what we're voted.
The people did vote him into office twice.
Yeah, that's right.
But the birth certificate issue, he has presented now 2 birth certificates, the one he originally presented, and then...
No, Alan, the first thing he presented was a certificate of live birth.
Right, which is what Hawaii made available. Right. And then Hawaii, though, upon release of the second one, which could only be made available at the request of the person involved, the state of Hawaii said this is a legitimate birth certificate.
Well, there are trained investigators who are finding out, and I can't divulge anything more than I will make a prediction that by September of this year it will be proven that that is not the case. It is not. And look, if there was a hospital in Hawaii in which the President of the United States had been born, and they had a birth certificate to prove it, don't you think there'd be a plaque, there'd be something that would indicate they're
what I
proud
don't
of
understand, though, Pat, is how is it that in two different Hawaiian publications, within weeks of the birth of Barack Obama in 1961, there were notices that are now on microfiche, you can find them. How could they have appeared in Hawaiian newspapers within weeks of his birth? How did that happen?
Well, the things that appeared in the papers were just blanket announcements of his birth.
Yeah, well, how would that...
But they didn't name a hospital or a birth certificate.
Well, why would it be in two Hawaiian newspapers?
Because somebody put them there.
All right, that was Pat Boone talking recently on the Alan Colmes radio program. What does he know? He specifically said that a bombshell will be released before or by September of this year. And if you listen to the rest of the interview, and you can hear it, I have it on our website right now at truenews.com. You can click on and listen to the entire interview. It's approximately 11 or 12 minutes long. He goes into detail talking about the city of Mombasa. And so Pat Boone clearly has knowledge that something is about to be released regarding Barack Hussein Obama. He also, in that interview, Alan Colmes asked him why he got involved in this topic of Obama's birth, and he said, because of a dream that I had. That's the first time I've heard about this. And I found a transcript of Pat Boone talking about the dream on another website, and it's an amazing story. And he said at the end of the dream that the Lord revealed the deception to the American people, that the blanket was pulled back and everybody saw the big lie. Well, anyhow, I'm trying to get Pat Boone to come back on True News. I want to talk to him about it. We're working on it right now. Listen, we are talking about the Perestroika Deception, and I brought all this information out today to try to help you wrap your mind around all of this bizarre stuff that's going on in the news every day. I mean, day after day after day, I'm reporting this stuff to you, and it's like, it's so bizarre, so weird. It's hard to even believe what's happening. So, it seems like everything going on in the news is a bad dream, but we need to consider the possibility that it is the result of a carefully planned and meticulously implemented deception campaign that has been underway for decades to bring down the United States of America. J.R. Nyquist was here yesterday. We started our discussion of the Perestroika Deception. Chris Steinle is here today, and we are going to continue our discussion of Anatoliy Golitsyn's book from 1995, The Perestroika Deception. This is a powerful book. It's hard to get a copy of it. There are only a few copies available out there on the internet. They're about $100 each. Chris, welcome back to the program. What do you think Pat Boone knows?
Well, I think the Lord is revealing things to different people. That's how he worked with me on this Perestroika Deception during that John Shorey interview a few weeks ago when we were talking about Russia and how Gog and Magog were going to attack Israel. And I thought, well, wait a minute now. Russia is now a professing moral Christian nation. Why would they be attacking Israel? And I had this problem in my mind. And I thought, something's going on here. This doesn't jive. This doesn't fit together. Well, I remembered that someone had sent me a PDF copy of the Perestroika Deception. And that popped into my head. Is there a deception? I knew it was about Russia. I really didn't know anything else about it. So as I thought about that, the next weekend, the Lord impressed on my heart that I needed to read that book, that I would find an answer there. So I began to read, and as I began to read the book, I saw the things that Golitsyn was saying and how 94% of those things had been fulfilled from his first book, from around 1985 when that one was published, and it was fulfilled by about the mid-90s.
Now, you're talking about his first book was called New Lies for Old.
Yes.
That was like 1984, 85.
Right. Well, when I went on reading, I discovered that many more things have been fulfilled since that time, and that this conversation about what he wrote got dropped, and it needed to be picked up again, and the American public needs to be made aware of these things that have been said in the book.
That's right. And I'll point out very quickly, Anatoliy Golitsyn, who's still alive to my knowledge, he would be, I guess probably about 80 years old right now. All I know is that officially he's still alive. He's under U.S. Protective Witness Program. He was a major in the Soviet Union K.G.B. He defected to the United States in the early 1960s, went to the C.I.A. and said, I have personal knowledge of a plan to deceive the United States and the West. And this plan, which he calls the Perestroika Deception, was crafted in 1958 to 1960. And this is, nearly 30 years before the Soviet Union, quote, fell and communism disappeared from Russia. And what he was telling the CIA in the early 60s was, this is the plan. They're going to make it appear that communism is going to fall, that the Soviet Union has become liberal, that it's a new day. And it's all a grand deception. So go ahead, Chris. This is fascinating stuff.
Okay. What they did is they used the experiences of Stalin and Lenin and their failings to draw up this general line, what they call a general line, which is what we would call a party line that we would draw up every 4 years. Or 2 years for our candidates.
Party platform.
Yes, and so they drew up this general line, and they based it to a great degree on The Art of War by Sun Tzu. And the main points of that was to appear weak, make the enemy think that they are strong, and to have a secret plan that doesn't change, that the enemy will lose because they don't know that plan. Well, some of the objectives of the general line, the perestroika, was to appear that capitalism had overcome socialism. But they really continued in control. Even though they became independent republics, they were still under the control of the party, what was the K.G.B.,
You're talking about
Central Committee.
The countries that were Soviet satellites.
Yeah, the
Politburo. Which are the eastern countries.
Right, correct. Was still under their control. And this was very easy for the K.G.B. and the Politburo because they were already underground. They simply moved the rest of their governance underground and gave the appearance that these countries were independent. Well, some of the things that were predicted by Golitsyn that have come to pass were the convergence of the Russian government with the West by reforming the Russian government or the USSR governments and socializing the Western civilization. So they were working on this convergence of both sides.
All right, so if I follow this, they were deliberately bringing some form of capitalism into the Soviet Union, which later became Russia, and at the same time introducing socialism into the capitalist countries such as the USA.
Yes.
For the purpose of at some point in the future, they would all meet in the middle.
Correct. And I just want to run through some of the objectives of the general line. They were going to use this capitalism as a means to influence the West through business partnerships and use the increased relationships to spread socialist ideas to the West. They also were going to enrich the communist bloc financially through the trading and also gain access to Western technology. They wanted to infiltrate Europe to influence them towards socialism, to infiltrate Western intelligence agencies. And it was important to them to create a European social state or a European Union as a Western buffer for the main nation of Russia.
So they wanted Europe to be integrated and consolidated into a single state.
Correct.
And
Correct.
right now we have the European Union once again demanding that it become a federal state with an elected president. And you're saying this is actually part of the Perestroika Deception.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And they used what they called disinformation, what Golitsyn calls disinformation to spread this convergence. I'm quoting here from the book. It says, the rationale of this disinformation is that there are two sorts of people, those who recognize change and seek to promote it, and those who oppose it. The implication being that those who oppose it are enemies of progress and peace, cold warriors, etc. And Gorbachev said at one point, referring to this conversation, we have both kinds of people in our countries. In other words, there are these conservatives that are against progress. They resist change. They're just enemies of what society needs to do.
And so the purpose of that statement was to make people in the West believe that the good Soviets were trying to get away from the Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist past, and they were trying to become good commies and be normal people. And so Gorbachev was saying, we have those kind of people in our country too, meaning we got these, quote, right-wingers
right.
that won't let us progress. They're against the progressive policies that we're trying to implement.
Correct.
But the truth is, those people who were on the surface opposing Gorbachev were told to do it, paid to do it, instructed to do it.
That's true, too.
It was all an act.
A controlled opposition, even controlled dissidents.
Controlled protest marches, controlled opposition parties, controlled opposition organizations, not only in Russia, but in the West, in the United States. They funded, they set up controlled opposition.
All right.
Right?
Some of the other things that they were pressing to do was to estrange the American people from their leaders, to demoralize the West, and then Russia appeared to all of a sudden be open to Christianity, to intellectuals, even dissenters. And they dropped their borders. They allowed their people to go, even the Jews, to be free. So the purpose of all this convergence was to make the West think that Russia was weak, so that the West might be disarmed. They wanted to weaken the U.S. so that they would withdraw from NATO, and they actually expected, according to the general line and Golitsyn's analysis, expected NATO to dissolve by the year 2000, which didn't happen. It's one of the predictions in Golitsyn's work that hasn't happened yet.
On that prediction right there, that their ultimate goal was to destroy NATO. Now, this is why we're doing this program, because weeks ago, I received a call from a source who had been given information that, regardless of what is being said in the news, Russia will invade Ukraine. There will be a limited war between Russia and Ukraine, and that Barack Obama will deliberately do nothing and will twiddle his thumbs. NATO will be impotent. Nothing will happen. And after that war, that short war between Russia and Ukraine, there will be many public calls denouncing the weakness of NATO. And this is what the source told me a month or two ago, that this is going to happen. Get ready for it, Rick. He said, my sources told me that this limited war is for the purpose of making NATO look weak. Obama is going to deliberately do nothing. The very next day, Chris, you come to me and you go, Rick, I've got to talk to you about an old book called Perestroika Deception. And you went into a discussion of it and you said the ultimate aim is to destroy NATO. And I did like this double take looking at it. It's like, wait a minute. I was just told this last night, that there's a movement coming this year to make NATO look weak. So we're watching this stuff be fulfilled in real time, Chris.
Yes. Let me mention some of the other things that have been fulfilled, and I want to get into some of the other predictions. That is, let me say the other predictions first. And you covered some of them yesterday on the show. But the fall of the Berlin Wall, Golitsyn predicted, the socialization of Europe, the socialization of America, the demoralization of the West, the convergence that we talked about, the weakening of the U.S. military, the rise of the Russian and Chinese military capabilities. Now, Golitsyn, a quote from the book again, it should never be forgotten that the ultimate objective of Soviet strategy is not perestroika in the USSR, but the restructuring of the American political and economic systems, including the military-industrial complex. Now, let's look at some of these things that have been fulfilled, as it were, in the final stages. This is what Golitsyn said, we're going to be the final stages of perestroika. And I'll quote from the book. He says, the central purpose of the third grand strategy and its final phase of perestroika is to renew the regimes in the USSR and other communist countries and to convert them into states of mature socialism with a human face. But the strategy goes beyond domestic restructuring and is aimed at the peaceful and non-peaceful conquest of the United States and Western Europe from within. So here are some of the things that will happen in the final stage. Okay? Europe and U.S. will firmly embrace socialism. NATO and U.S. military will be weakened. There will be a reintroduction of the class struggle argument. Now let's talk about that for a minute.
The 99 and the 1%?
Yeah, but do you remember how that class struggle argument went away? It wasn't there for several decades. You never heard anything about that.
Suddenly it came back.
And suddenly it's come back. Well, Golitsyn said this would be an indication that we've gone into the final stages when that conversation comes up about
when they start bringing Marxism back into the public discourse.
And this is why Hillary Clinton has to get out of owning those millions of dollars so that she can get elected to represent the poor, struggling class. Yes.
Well, she's doing her best to try to tell everybody she's broke and suffering and she only has a few millions of dollars and it's a hard life on her.
Oh, it'll work. Yeah. It'll work. Okay. Demoralization of the West. And we see that in the sexual immorality, the things you went over at the beginning of the program. Okay, here's one of the things. Estrangement of the American people from their leaders.
And that's where we're at right now.
So you see,
we don't trust anybody.
The courts are making decisions that the people have indicated they don't want. The president is making decisions that the people have indicated is not their will. You see, and that's one of the goals.
And the
that
Congress
Golitsyn
will not
stated.
do what we're demanding that they do.
Correct. And so really, there's only a couple things left, the fall of NATO and the withdrawal of the United States from NATO. And Golitsyn said they were expecting that the United States would be so weakened at this point, even by the year 2000, that they would actually withdraw from NATO, and that hasn't happened
yet.
And
of course, then Russia would get all those NATO military bases by default in Europe.
Yeah, well, actually, the goal is for the USSR to run from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It's the manifest destiny of the Western world, or the Eastern world.
But wait a minute. Right now, we've got two top secret treaties being negotiated. An Atlantic treaty, trade treaty, that George Bush said years ago would unite Europe and the United States. And another top secret trade treaty is the Asian Pacific Treaty, that even the members of Congress don't even know what's in these treaties. So it sounds to me like the Pacific and the Atlantic are being united. That's underway right now with these trade treaties.
That's correct.
Chris, listen to this. I'm reading this from Perestroika Deception. Again, this is 1995. Now, okay, all of us here, we've witnessed over the years how words have changed. I mean, when we were young, the word gay meant jovial, happy. Now it means homosexual. They've changed the meaning of the words like tolerant and so forth. The USA Patriot Act, it's not patriotic, it's fascist. They're in control of the words. Whoever controls words and their meanings control the society. I'm reading, this is from Perestroika Deception, but he quoted a 1984 book called Survival is Not Enough by Richard Pipes, and this was about the ideas of Italian communist Antonio Gramsci. It says, quote, such mastery is secured in the first place by control of the organs of information. The objective is to control thought at the source, that is, in the mind that absorbs and processes the information. And the best way of accomplishing this is by shaping words and phrases in the desired manner. Moreover, control of the Western mind is to be achieved not only by means of the dishonest use of language, but also through operations to demoralize the West through corrosive attacks on society's institutions, the active promotion of drug abuse, the spread of agnosticism, nihilism, permissiveness, and concerted attacks on the family in order to destabilize society. Religion and traditional cultural and moral values must be destroyed before the revolution can be successful. It's 1984.
Yes. We see all these things happening now.
They've been happening. They've been happening for decades. The termites have been under the foundation of the nation, eating away. And now the entire building is ready to implode.
One of the things that occurred to me about a week ago, because I have studied, and many of us have studied Babylon in America looking like Babylon of Revelation. And at this point, I am seriously considering that there are these sinister forces that are methodically grooming America to be end times Babylon for the sole purpose of destroying the country in fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
All right, that's Chris, you've been here. That's probably the most far-out thing you've said so far.
It absolutely is the most far-out thing I've said so far.
See what happens when you hang around us here at True News?
Yeah, I know. And so it's just a thought. But, when you study these things, you see that America's great commerce center lives in luxury, making other nations rich, buying their merchandise, adulterous in regard to loyalty to God, sexually immoral, and the beast that she rides that no one can make war with is the world's policeman. So we all agree, we see these things as America, as Babylon. So
you're saying that this sinister, diabolical plan, Perestroika Deception, that was launched in the 60s, was to change America from being a godly Christian nation into a wicked, sinful, lustful nation that morphed into Babylon so that its only end result would be to be destroyed.
I would go beyond that and say that I believe recently they've picked up on the conversations of American Christians who have come to the conclusion that they're living in Babylon and that they're actually helping to fulfill that story. They're actually grooming. They're actually working towards that. And let me say that this is how that might be happening. Mm-hmm. They're working at the same time to make Babylon appear to be evil. And by they, I'm not talking about Russia. I'm talking about the party, the Communist Party, global Communist Party that's infiltrated all over the world and into our leadership.
Because they used Russia for their purposes for decades.
Correct. But I want to assure Christian listeners in Russia, we're not accusing them of plotting against the U.S., but merely saying that the Communist Party has picked up these observations and prophecies that America is Babylon, and that they've incorporated these things in their plan, in their tactical strategy to destroy the country.
And I believe the Communist Party is the political arm of the Church of Satan. It is the political party of the Synagogue of Satan. And what we're up against, the Communist Party is simply the political arm of Satan's empire.
Okay, but they've put on this face, as far as Russia, the nation of Russia, they've put on this face of Christianity and morality. There's two sides to the script. They're the instigators, and they're also the future instrument of God's judgment. Let me explain. They, the communist movement, are actively involved in portraying America as decadent, rich, sexually immoral, even abominable in the sight of God. And at the same time, Russia is positioning itself as a bastion of morality and godliness so that they will appear to be justified in leading the world in the destruction of the great harlot. America's leaders, who are obviously following instructions from the Communist Party, are purposefully throwing America under the bus. They're methodically impressing upon Americans and the rest of the world that America is sold out to immorality, totally given over to sexual sin. And we see the examples that you gave earlier, the president going to Hawaii and saying homosexuality is an American value, and John Kerry saying, I'm working hard to ensure that during my tenure we will have lesbian, bisexual, transgender ambassadors in our rank, and they're running up the rainbow flag over the embassy in Israel. So they're doing all these things to impress upon the world our sinfulness, and at the same time, in this final phase, Russia is rising up to actually be a righteous judge of America and fulfill that. You know, we saw that article by Alexander Dugin. You pointed it out to me, the Russian scholar. And
who is an advisor to Mr. Putin.
That's right. He's actually called Putin's brain. And I want to make a couple quotes that he said. He said, quote, "The USA is a chimerical, anti-organic, transplanted culture which does not have sacral state traditions and cultural soil, but nevertheless tries to force upon the other continents its anti-ethnic, anti-traditional, Babylonic model." And again, here's another quote.
So he referred to America as Babylon.
Yeah.
This is a man called Putin's brain.
Yes, and here's another one. Quote, "We must create strategic alliances to overthrow the present order of things, of which the core could be described as human rights, anti-hierarchy, and political correctness. Everything that is the face of the beast, the Antichrist." So they're referring to America as the beast, as Antichrist, as Babylon. Now, we went over those final stages of perestroika. There's only a couple predictions that have not happened yet. One is predicted by Golitsyn that America would become so weak that it would drop out of NATO by 2000. And the other prediction is the Bible prophecy that Babylon will persecute the saints before it is destroyed. The Communist Party may try to kill these two birds with one stone. Let me explain that. To further weaken the U.S. through persecution while fulfilling the prophecy, and then to eventually eliminate the U.S. so that the party, the Communist Party, becomes the only world superpower. How about that? The book of Revelation says the great harlot will have on her forehead a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. Then St. John wrote, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. The persecution of Christians is one of the only prophecies that hasn't yet been fulfilled by the United States. I used to think that atheists and humanists were going to become violent and persecute the Christians of America, but now I'm beginning to think that the party has been training radical Muslims like ISIS just so they can make their way into the U.S. and carry out this persecution. And I believe this persecution will be on a scale of the persecution of the early church. Either way, once the persecution begins, Russia may actually invade the U.S. under the guise of protecting persecuted Christians. Russians may even try to free Christians from FEMA camps and prisons to get them out of the country during this charade. Isn't that bizarre? But after this mock campaign against Christian persecution, the U.S. will be destroyed by fire in fulfillment of Bible prophecy, and this will leave the Chinese-Russian bloc as the world's only superpower.
Chris, Pat Boone mentioned this prophetic dream. And I know very little about it, except I went back and I tried to find a transcript, and he said in the dream, the Lord pulled back the blanket, revealed the deception so that the people could stop it. Now, again, it's a dream, okay? And a dream doesn't line up with biblical prophecy. I understand that. Is there any possibility that the Lord is trying to stop us from committing national suicide?
Well, I certainly believe he wants Christians to know what's happening. He absolutely wants us to know the truth. He's the God of truth.
So that they understand the depth of the deception and why the destruction took place.
Yes. And if these conclusions that I've been coming to are correct, then what should American Christians be doing? If America is Babylon, then the Bible gives the directive to come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins and lest you receive of her plagues. And that means if the Lord provides a way, then Christians need to be getting out of the country as soon as possible. But it may be for many people that God has not only granted them to believe in Jesus, but also to suffer for his name's sake. We see this in Scripture. But there are a lot of people who just may not be called to get out of here. But people need to realize that if they do stay here and they are imprisoned, they'll probably never get out of those prisons or camps before America is destroyed. This is the reality. This is the truth that needs to be taken to heart so that people know how to respond. And I believe time is very short because we're in the final phase of this strategy now.
That's the point. That's the point. We're in the final stage. The termites have been eating away at the society for decades. The damage perhaps is irreparable. Only God knows that. Whether it can be halted and the foundation shored up and the nation salvaged, that it does not collapse. If this is prophecy being fulfilled and America has been turned into Babylon, then you're not going to stop it. That's the part we don't know. That's the part we're all wrestling with individually. But for certain, we're in the very final stage of this deception.
Absolutely.
And this is a very dangerous stage. Very dangerous stage. What you and I are doing right now over the airwaves and through the internet, this is very dangerous because if we are exposing the last stage of this operation, then this could cause complications for what people are trying to accomplish. But this is a very dangerous stage right now because the country's being taken down. And people need to know how dangerous it is, and they need to be right with God.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
This is not a time to be, to have hidden sins in your life. It's not a time to be playing with the devil on the side. You've got to be sure that your life is right with God, and you have repented of your sins, and you're forgiven, and you need to know that you are ready to leave this world physically. Because if this is Babylon, and destruction does come, most of the people are going to perish. I guess all the people are going to perish. It doesn't mean you spiritually perish. You'll be with the Lord, but your physical body will perish. And that's why it's so essential to know what the will of the Lord is for you at this hour. Whether He's calling on you to leave or to stay. Because all of us are going to have to face a new tomorrow and a new world that exists without the United States of America if this plan is carried out. Chris, I appreciate you being here today. This was part 2 of the Perestroika Deception. You can get a copy of it. It's hard to find, but there are online versions of it. Read it. Wake up. It's happening.